I'm delighted to be back with you this morning. It is good to be back here in this place. Since the last time we were together, it seems forever. We took a trip to Asheville, North Carolina, and then I went with Travis this past weekend to the Deep South Founders Conference in Jackson, and so it's been a whirlwind over the last couple of weeks, and so I'm delighted to be back here with you. And I'm especially grateful for Brian stepping to this pulpit and preaching last week. And what he did not know at the time was that he was preaching an introduction to where I'm going now. He didn't know it at the time, but the Lord in His providence used His message to get us going. And I'm so grateful for His willingness to preach and His willingness to tackle a subject which, frankly, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to do. But nonetheless, it is with deep gratitude that I'm glad that he was here. And it's good to be back with you. We now have completed our study of the book of Joshua, and so it is time for us to move to a new sermon series. And this morning I'm going to begin a series from the small little epistles of John that you find in the back of your New Testament. And this morning I want to begin by telling you why I have chosen these three little letters to preach from next. And I will confess right off the bat that one of the reasons that I have chosen these particular letters is because the author's name begins with the letter J. Yes, I know that's foolish and stupid, but I'm kind of on a roll here, with James and Jude and Joshua and John. I've already preached to the Gospel of John, so I couldn't go there, but the epistles of John seem like the logical next place, and I'm very much toying with preaching to the book of Job next, although I'm hoping someone will talk me out of it. These are three little letters that I've never actually had the opportunity to preach through before, even topically. I don't have anything ever from these books, even in that sense. I have taught them in Sunday school in the past, but I've never preached through them, and so it seemed reasonable to do that because it has been my goal, at least for the remaining years that the Lord gives me on this planet, to preach stuff that I have not preached before. There's 66 books in this Bible, and many of which I've not yet covered, so it seems reasonable to go to something I haven't taught before. Now, these are short letters, but they are rich theologically and doctrinally. It may take more time than you think to get through these letters, because 1 John particularly is deep and rich and may take some time to get through. And because we have spent some time in the Old Testament, it's time to go back into the New Testament. It's time to return there. So we'll go back to these works in the New Testament. And again, I want to go to a theological work. We've just spent a great deal of time in a narrative, a historical narrative. So I want to go back to a didactic work now, to a teaching work that we have. And I also want to do these for the same reason that I did Jude. These little letters are obscure. They're not at the forefront of preaching schedules. You don't see a lot of preachers working their way through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, although I'm not sure why, but they're fairly obscure. They're not Pauline letters, of course. They're written by the Apostle John, as we'll see in a moment. They're not from James. So there's a little bit of a difference here from what we've seen before. That's another reason that I have set them. And I do believe that these books will actually be more difficult to preach than you might think, as you will note by the end of our time today. These letters will be wonderful to study, but they may be difficult to preach because they have so much richness, theological depth, and there are some things that John is going to say here which are going to challenge so much of the prevalent thinking of our day, and that's why they'll be kind of troubling. So all of those are reasons that I stir into the pot as to why I have chosen to pick up these three little letters. As always, I start with an introduction sermon. It is necessary to do that for a number of reasons. You need an opening sermon before you actually get into the words of the book itself to do what I think are four things that need to be done. Number one, we need to establish the details. There are a number of simple details of the book that we need to understand: who wrote it, when was it written, to whom was it written to, etc., to make sure that we're going into the letter properly. Okay, we need those details. And it is my intention to do an introduction before each of the three letters. So today's introduction is really going to be just over 1 John. 2nd and 3rd John are different from 1 John in some very real senses, and so I'm going to need to do a different introduction sermon before those. Secondly, this introduction is designed to establish context. We here at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church ascribe to the grammatical historical, or some call it the historical grammatical approach to Scripture. And what we mean by that is that we believe that when the author wrote the letter, he had an intention at the time that he wrote it, to the audience he wrote it to, in the historical milieu that he lived in, to communicate to them. It's our responsibility then not to read this letter from what we think it should say to us, but rather what did the author, using the words that he did, to the audience he wrote it to, what was he intending to say to them? And then from that, hopefully, we will also learn a lesson from it. There's far too much reader response technique being used in preaching around the Bible nowadays, where people approach the Bible from the perspective of, well, here's what I wanted to say, so I'm going to read it through the lens of my own presuppositions, and I make it say what I want it to say. That's not how we approach the Scriptures. We approach the Scriptures from the perspective that a man living in the late 1st century wrote to a specific audience using specific words in his day to communicate something to them. What is that? And then once we discover that, that will help us to understand what the Lord wants us to understand from it. So thirdly, we also want to establish interest. I certainly hope that by the time we're done this morning that you will have a desire to enter into this book and be willing, more importantly, to be changed by it. That as we approach this material, that it will actually have, that as we go through this introduction and approach this material, that it will raise up an interest in you. Maybe even an interest to the point that you read the thing over the course of the week. Right? Such that you say, hey, I want to be prepared and be ahead, and so I know where he's going to be going as we enter into it. And then finally, not only do we need to establish details, context, and interest, but let me also suggest that we need to establish a purpose. Where are we going with this? What is this book really going to teach us? What is the purpose of this work, and how is it going to affect us in the here and now? At least in an introductory way, we should at least have some idea of what the writer was trying to say, so that we can then turn around and say, what's the purpose for us? Okay, so we want to establish some sense of purpose in this introduction. So these are the sorts of things that I want to do this morning with you. So let's start with the context of this first letter of John, the context of this letter. Now, the very first problem that we have with 1 John is to ask, all right, what is this thing? What is this work which we have called 1 John? All right, and in a more technical way, we ask the question, what is the genre of this work? What is this thing that we're looking at? You might assume automatically that you know what it is, but I might dissuade you of that in a second. The genre of a work is the category of artistic composition contained in the work. What category of artistic composition is contained in this? And what are its similarities of form and style and subject matter to other works, particularly other works in the Bible as a whole? There are a number of different genres in the Bible. There's the historical genre like Joshua, Genesis, Samuel, the two letters of Samuel, the book of Ezra, the book of Acts in the New Testament. Those are historical works. What happened, when it happened, who did it, who said it, etc. Historical genres. There's poetic genre. The Psalms, Proverbs, Lamentations are poetic books. There are biographical books, of course, describing the life of an individual. Joshua, in some ways, was a biography. I would argue it's much more historical than biographical. But certainly the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are biographical works. They describe the life and teachings of Jesus. There are prophetic works in Scripture, naturally, of course. Isaiah, Jeremiah. There are 13 minor prophets that are all prophetic works. There are epistolary works, or the word I used earlier, didactic works, teaching works, like the entirety of Paul's writings, his corpus of works, the letter of James, etc. They're didactic works designed to teach something. They're theological in foundation. And then, of course, there's apocalyptic works, like the book of Revelation, which is otherwise known as the Apocalypse, and books like Daniel and others that fall into that particular category. So there are a number of genres in Scripture, and many of the books of the Bible contain more than one of these subtypes. There's more than one genre in many of the books of the Bible. As I said a moment ago, Joshua is historical narrative, but it's also biographical. It talks about the man, Joshua, but it also talks about the history of the man. So it's a little of both. It's history around the man in Israel, but it's also about the man himself. The fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, for example, is both biographical, it's about Jesus, and didactic. Some would argue it's also apocalyptic, but it's strongly didactic with a biographical thread running through it. The life of Jesus is being laid out, but as you read the fourth gospel, it doesn't show that biography in the same way that Mark and Luke and Matthew do, because John's intention was to give us more of a theological understanding of the life of Christ than a biographical one. And so the fourth gospel sort of melds together these two different genres. So the natural question is, what genre does 1 John fit into? Now, you might automatically answer that question by saying, well, it's obviously an epistle. It's obviously didactic in nature, right? It's written by a man as an epistle, like James and Jude and the letters of Paul and so forth, and we might immediately do that. But here's what's fascinating about this letter, which we're going to discover almost immediately upon entering into it. It doesn't have many of the characteristics of a typical epistle. It's missing a number of key elements of a typical epistle. You think about the book of Romans as Paul wrote to the Romans. The book starts with a greeting, moves to a thesis, has a whole set of indicatives or truth statements that are being built from the thesis, a set of imperatives that flow out of those indicatives, meaning commands that are required to do by virtue of what you now know to be true, followed by a closing statement with some additional greetings. None of that appears in 1 John. That structure is not at all in the letter. It has no greeting. There's no identification of the author at the outset and no greeting to the audience. It has no closing statement at the end. The thesis of the letter is never stated directly. It has to be deduced, which I hope to accomplish later today. It has a poetic form in terms of how it's actually written. You will see that. And it repeats some key themes again and again, which I'll come back to again in a moment. So, at first glance, it looks like an epistle, but then it doesn't have all the characteristics of an epistle. So, I am convinced that like the fourth gospel, like the Gospel of John, this work stands distinct with other epistolary content in the New Testament. Just as the Gospel of John is different from the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it has the earmarks of a gospel account with the details of Jesus' life, but it's intertwined with great theological conclusions. It's like the Gospels, and yet very distinct from the Gospels. We put it into the Gospels. In fact, we call it the fourth Gospel because it's part of the biographical sense of Jesus' life, but yet it's very different from a biography, so we kind of lump it in, and yet it's distinct. Well, may I suggest to you that's exactly what 1 John is. It is like the other epistles in the New Testament, but it is utterly different than the other epistles. The closest genre of 1 John would be an epistle. Certainly it is didactic in nature. But at the same time, it is highly distinguished from the other epistles in that it doesn't look like a letter. In fact, here's an interesting theory that's been proposed about 1 John. I like it. That this is actually a set of sermon notes that someone wrote down from John preaching in Ephesus, and was reformed then into something that could be sent out. In fact, it could very well be John's own notes himself for the sermon that he was preaching, and then he reformed it into something that he could send out into the world. I think that's a fascinating theory. Probably of a sermon that he himself had delivered. Now, it says 13 times in this letter, I am writing or I write. Okay, that phrase appears 13 different times in the letter. So we can't ignore the fact that this is a written work. It's clearly a written work, but the content and style is not typical of a letter, so the theory of this being a set of sermon notes has been advanced to suggest that, well, what was really going on is that the author wrote a series of ideas on paper, preached a sermon from that outline that he had written, and then someone, maybe himself, took that set of outline and turned it into something that he could send out to others. You know, they didn't have audio tapes in those days. So someone may have written down his sermon. And the structure of the letter gives rise to that idea, especially if this was an extemporaneous sermon, meaning someone standing there and just sort of talking. And you'll see that, I hope, as we go along. That's a possibility. Who knows? But what we do know is that it just doesn't look like a letter in the traditional sense. Now, we'll call it that from this point on, just for ease, but be aware that there's some question of that. Now, who wrote it? Manuscript evidence, first century manuscript evidence that we have is unanimous that this letter was written by a man named John, and that's true of both this letter, 1 John, and 2nd and 3rd John. The author is not explicitly named. In fact, he doesn't use his name. Paul always used his name at the beginning of his letters, but this particular author did not. He chose not to do so. But ancient manuscripts often had the name of the author written in the margin at the top of the letter. This was a common first century technique, and it makes sense that you would. I mean, you have some piece of work here, okay, whose work is this? And even though the author himself may not have said so, somebody else would have written in the manuscript. Based on the manuscripts that we have, this letter is clearly from a man named John. And the manuscript tradition, which dates back very early, by the way, the letters of John as well as the Gospel of John have datings all the way back into the very early 2nd century. So we have strong manuscript evidence that this was written by a man by the name of John. The question, of course, is which John. There are a number of them in the New Testament. But the style and vocabulary and even substance of this letter is so similar to the 4th Gospel that an authorship by the writer of that work is strongly suggested. There's no way to get around the fact that this letter and the 4th Gospel have so much in common that the idea that some other John wrote this letter just doesn't make sense. It's much more likely that this letter was written by the same man who wrote the 4th Gospel. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the 4th Gospel, the word for faith, the Greek word for faith, is only used in the verbal form, to believe. The verbal sense of a verb, an action. Believing is not just something possessed, it's something done in the 4th Gospel. Every single time that word is used in the 4th Gospel is used that way. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes, the word believes in that case would better be translated, whoever continues in his belief. It's a verbal word. It's a verb. It's not just he who once prayed a prayer is saved. No. It's a continuing action. That's the case in the 4th Gospel and all the way through. And guess what? That pattern continues in this letter. With one exception in chapter 5, verse 4, every other use of the word faith in this letter is in that verbal form. To believe is an action from the perspective of this writer. Secondly, not only does that characteristic exist between both the 4th Gospel and this letter, but major themes also overlap. The nature and incarnation of Christ are key themes in both the 4th Gospel and in the first letter of John. The relationship between faith and obedience is a common theme in the fourth gospel, it is also here. And the primacy of love as truly knowing God is a key element of both this gospel, the fourth gospel, and this letter. And I'll come back to that thought because it's important. So I am convinced, and most of the church has been convinced down through the centuries, even liberal scholarship in the 19th century agreed, this letter was probably written by John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, one of the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, Peter, James, and John, and the one who describes himself in the gospel, chapter 21, verse 20, as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, I'm planting that seed in your mind. I want you to hold on to that phrase because we're coming back to it eventually. In fact, in the fourth gospel, there is a sense that the writer treats himself as Jesus' best friend. Of all the disciples of Jesus, that this one treats himself being Jesus' closest friend. You remember, it's this John who is a part of the inner circle of Jesus' apostle, who appears, for example, with him at the Transfiguration, who is with him in the garden, coming closer to him during his great prayer, etc. He is also the same John that appears with Peter in Acts chapter 3 as the first apostles to preach the gospel in Jerusalem, the two that become sort of the primary apostles to go out now after the Pentecost event, to go out and preach the gospel to the Jews around Jerusalem. And it's confirmed in the fourth gospel by the appearance of the apostle John in chapter 21, both verses 2 and 24. In fact, I would even go one step further to make this argument. The style and difference between the Gospel of John, the fourth gospel, and the other gospels lends strong credence that this letter was also written by someone who knew what epistles looked like but wrote one very different. Just as he wrote a gospel very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which I'm convinced he knew about, he had possession of potentially, but he wanted to write something very different from them because he wanted to describe the Logos of God, which Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't really do straight out. He wanted to describe that. That same man would look and write an epistle very different from all the other epistles. Makes strong sense that this same man wrote this one because it was different. Just the idea of being different suggests John. It is highly likely then that John the Apostle wrote this letter late in the first century, somewhere around 90 to 95 AD, from the city of Ephesus. In fact, you note at the end of the Gospel of John that Jesus predicts or prophesies that John would live to be an old man, that he would not die as a martyr as the others would, and so there is that. It is highly likely also that this letter was written along with the fourth gospel as some of the last works of the Old Testament after, now catch this, after the book of Revelation. I know, and everybody says the book of Revelation is the last book in the Bible, but here's the problem with that. We know from extant sources, particularly Eusebius, that John returned from Patmos after 2 years of exile. It is highly likely then that the Apostle John, after escaping from Patmos after his exile, went back to Ephesus, which is where he was based, to that place there, became the theologian in residence in that place, and while there, wrote his gospel and these letters, and maybe did a little preaching too while he was there, because this could be some sermon notes, and those things went out from Ephesus late in his life. The apocalypse that he saw and wrote down, potentially even distributing it after he got back from Ephesus, along with an explanation of who this Christ was in terms of his earthly life after experiencing his heavenly life in the apocalypse on Patmos. Irenaeus, through Polycarp, confirmed that John, in fact, did write from Ephesus, and Irenaeus was an early 2nd century church father. He would have known. So I think it's reasonable that the Apostle John went to Ephesus as this theologian in residence, wrote the gospel and this particular these particular letters. There is even extant evidence of a Johannine school centered at Ephesus in the early 2nd century. In other words, after 100 AD, probably after John dies. There's a group of followers of John, quote unquote, that continue his ministry out from Ephesus even after he is gone. And there's evidence of that we have outside. So it is highly likely that John the Apostle wrote his gospel and these letters from Ephesus very late in the 1st century. And it is also likely that John wrote these letters, or maybe, should I say, preached these sermons, to a church or churches struggling to stay faithful, while some had drifted away from the faith or went out from the church with an anti-Christian message. In chapter 2 and verse 19, it says, "They went out from us, but they were not of us, for if they had been of us, they would have continued with us, but they went out that it might become plain that they are not of us." He's writing to people who are struggling with the fact that there have been some in their congregation who have left, have gone away. And John is writing, in a sense, both his gospel and these epistles, or preaching these sermons to encourage the churches. Now, which church would need such encouragement? The answer would be the church at Ephesus. We know from the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, that there were a number of churches around Ephesus who were struggling with various things. But you remember the specific thing that John said about the church at Ephesus? Remember what he said? You have lost your first love. He's there, I think, in Ephesus. And what is he going to talk about? He's going to talk about the idea of the love of God to a church that has abandoned that first love. Jesus has come to John and said, that church at Ephesus, which, by the way, I'm sending you back to when this exile is done, they've lost their first love. So what would be the obvious thing to preach about when you get there? The love of God. So the letter itself probably written by the Apostle John along with the fourth gospel, sometime around 90 to 95, late 1st century, and written to an audience of people who are struggling with apostasy in their presence. So let's talk now about the content of this little letter. One of the things that you'll discover about 1 John, and one of the reasons it's going to be hard to preach, is because John is going to keep going over the same material again and again and again and again. I was trying to figure out what kind of illustration would best be used to describe this book. I want to plant in your mind a picture of what this book looks like. Okay, here it is. Imagine a whirlwind. In the South, we might call it a hurricane. In the Midwest, we might call it a tornado. Okay? Either way, it's the same idea, right? A swirling wind around a center of some sort. The rhetoric of this letter is challenging. The writer rarely sustains a clear line of argument for more than a few lines. He wanders from subject to subject, often returning to make the same point again. Okay? Looks like a whirlwind, doesn't it? Starts here, makes a comment, goes around, but guess what? He winds up right back where he starts again, and around he goes, and around he goes, and around he goes, and on it appears. His thought pattern is circular. Keeps coming back, around and around and around, again and again. And it's like a whirlwind in that it sweeps content out from the center as it moves along, right? As a tornado moves along, it picks up stuff and flings it out to the outside, and then it moves along. So it's moving along the ground at a speed, but it's flinging material out from the center. That's the idea. Hurricanes do that, right? So you have this sense in which this is going along in this sense. I'll give you a couple of examples from the letter itself. The Son of God has come in the flesh. Okay, the incarnation, I mentioned that a moment ago. You see it in chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, again in chapter 4, verse 2, again in chapter 5, verse 20, again and again and again. Another key theme in this letter, denial of Jesus as the Son is denial of the Father. Okay, so he's come in the flesh, and if you deny that, you've denied the Father. You see it in chapter 2, verse 22 and following, 4, 2 and following, 5, 10 to 12. So in a short little letter, the theme is repeated again and again. Thirdly, to know Christ as the Son is to forsake sin. You see that appear in chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. Okay, so you see these recurring themes appearing again. The Son has come in the flesh. If you deny that, you're forsaking the Father, and to really know him is to forsake sin. So he repeats those three things, just as three examples, 3 times each in the letter. Whirlwind. Around and around and around it goes. In fact, some have even suggested that this whirlwind effect is evidence of the verbal nature of this work. Right? If you're just getting up and talking extemporaneously and you're just sort of using a loose set of notes, you have a tendency to go over the same ground again and again, right? If you're not using an outline, as I am, you have a tendency very often to just kind of stand up and speak, and you find yourself saying the same thing again, and you say it again, and then you say it again. Have you ever had that situation where you say, well, why did I say that 3 times? I didn't need to say that. I need to say it once. Because it's a verbal reality in human speech. We do that. It's very possible that this is a set of extemporaneous sermon notes published as a letter. Now, let me suggest that even though it's a whirlwind, it does have a center. Okay? It does have a center, as all whirlwinds do. And 1 John does have a central theme. Now, here's what's interesting. Commentators are utterly divided over what that center is. Again, when you got this whirlwind approach, it's like, okay, what's in the middle of that? So what goes around that? What is it going around and around and around? In fact, there are some commentators, Calvin, for example, in his commentary says, don't really know what the center of this book is, just a bunch of random thoughts. As much as I appreciate John Calvin, I think he's wrong on that, because I do think there is a central theme in this letter. I do think that there is a specific point to get through. And the way that I think you find it is by asking this most fundamental axiomatic question. What is the central word or phrase repeated in the book? What's the central word or phrase that's repeated in the book? I've said many times that if you see a word or phrase repeated in a section of Scripture, it's probably the theme of that section. I've said that 1,000 times. I got that from Wetherell Johnson years and years and years ago. The whirlwind idea of this book suggests that a specific repetition is probably the theme, being brought up again and again from the center to highlight various periphery ideas. In other words, if you can see the same thing again and again and again being swept up from the center, then that's probably the center, right? Because it keeps getting blown out to the edges. And so what you're looking for is repetition. Layered on top of that, the repetition you're looking for would be a repetition that's specifically talking about something traced to the nature of God himself. Tracing itself to the nature of God. If you can find repetition then that's traced to the very nature about God, then it's clearly didactory in nature. Now again, that would not be the approach of most preachers to a book. Most preachers would come to the letter, okay, what does it say about us? Right? And look for the theme around us. But biblical authors are not interested in you or me. I'm sorry to break that news to you. They're not really interested in you. They're interested in explaining and advancing the nature of God. And that will hopefully then sweep you up into what it is that we are to be in the face of that. Who is God is much more an important question than who are you? Because who are you is answered in the light of who is God. So if we are looking at a repetition of phrases or repeated ideas in this letter, and we can find repetition that's specifically about the nature of God himself flowing out, then we've probably found the theme of the letter. And I might even go so far as to suggest, I don't even have this in an outline because it just popped into my head at this moment. The fourth gospel is built along that same line. John wasn't writing about the apostles or the disciples. He's writing about the Logos. It's centered upon him. Because what he wanted to do was to say, listen, I know you've got a biography of Jesus from Matthew and Mark and Luke, and they tell you a lot about who Jesus was. But let me tell you who Jesus was in the grand sense of him as the Logos of God. So this writer is doing the same thing, focusing our attention upon the very nature of God. And what we find in this letter, that there are two great ontological statements of God in the letter. Okay, yep, I used that word again. Ontological, the study of being. What is something, okay? Who is God in sense of what is his nature? What is his being? What is his substance? What is he made of, if you will? That's ontological. There are two great ontological statements in this book. God is blank. There are two of them in this book. And I think that these ontological concepts become the center because they're repeated. And they flow out from a source of other material, other repetition that you'll see. Okay? So, there are two of these in the letter. The first is found in chapter 1, verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him, that is the Father, and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. This particular phrase, that God is by his very nature light, implies that what the author is saying is that God is the fullest revelation of knowledge and truth. That it is from God that all knowledge comes. It is from God that all truth comes. It is from God that all revelation of purpose and intention in this world comes. As I said in my prayer a little while ago, human beings are stumbling around in the dark looking for some sort of answer to who they are and why they exist and where they're going. But that knowledge can only come from God. It can only come from a creator who has established them. And the term light and its corresponding opposite, darkness, appears 7 times in the letter. 7 different times in this letter the concept of light and darkness appears. In fact, just in the verse I read to you, you saw both light and darkness in the same verse. It's a key idea in this letter. Additionally, it is a prevalent concept in the fourth gospel. In the Gospel of John, the idea of light is very important. It appears in the prologue. The light has come into the world, right? We've seen this. It appears 5 times with Jesus as the Logos of God in that prologue. And it is key in Jesus' own teachings about himself. 19 times in the Gospel of John, Jesus refers to himself as light. I am the light of the world, being the most pronounced of those statements. It's a common idea in the Gospel of John. It is also a common idea here in this letter. Unfortunately, the word light, the repetition of the word light, fades after chapter 2. Pardon the pun. After chapter 2, the word doesn't appear again, and it is replaced by a much more prevalent word in this account. And that word is the word love. And the phrase, God is love, okay, God ontologically as love appears in both chapter 4, verse 8, and chapter 4, verse 16. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love. And whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. The idea of God is love is the idea that God is by his very nature the description and expression of divine love. The term love in this book comes from a single common root word. That root word is agape, and it appears in this book 52 times. The letter itself is only 105 verses long, and yet 30 of the 105 verses contain this word agape. A third of this letter has this word in it, and the majority of the verses that use the word use it twice, 52 times in 30 verses in 105 verses total. Sometimes this word is used as a noun, meaning to have, to possess, love as a substance within us. Sometimes it's used as a verb, to love, to express love to others. And sometimes, believe it or not, 6 times in this letter, it is used in Brian's most desiring way to speak of us, beloved. I like it. I do. I've never been trained to use it, but that's okay. Beloved, to be loved, to be the one who has been loved. So it's used as a noun, something you possess. It's used as a verb, something you do. And it's even used as an adjective, something you are. Which means that about a third of the verses in this letter use this word, and most, as I said, twice in the same verse. Now, this word agape, and this is the only word that's ever used in this book to describe love, okay? There are other words for love in the Greek language. It's the only one that's used in this particular letter. Needs to be defined before we can go into this letter. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at agape. As I said, it's contained in 30 verses of this book, so we're going to see it many, many times. But I want to give you just an initial definition of this word. So, I cranked out my own definition of it. Calvin's definition is fine, but it's too wordy. I want to give you what I think is a succinct definition of this word, agape. It is the preordained connection and commitment of God towards others. Period. The preordained connection and commitment of God towards others. Now, notice, God is love, right? Which means that this word is being used to describe who God is, his ontological nature and its results. So, first, it is a connection. It is a connection. The love of God is a personal relationship of God to specific persons. It is not what James White calls a peanut butter spreading of some sort of emotional connection of God across the entirety of the human race. You know, you take peanut butter out of the jar, right? And if it's not crunchy, you can actually spread the stuff, right? And you spread it on the bread. The crunchy stuff just rips your bread apart. I like it, but, you know. No, it's not this peanut butter idea that you can just spread it across. No, it's a specific personal relationship of God to specific persons. It's a connection to specific individuals. It's God connecting himself to beings outside of himself that he has created and now comes to relate to them. It's a connection, and a personal one at that. Secondly, it's a commitment. It's a commitment. It's the committed relationship of God to its people. It's not some general sense of emotional, quote-unquote, attachment, but a relationship built upon a deep foundational commitment. How many times have I said that love is not an emotion? Love is a commitment. Yes, there's a whole lot of times that my wife looks at me with great disdain, but she still loves me. Why? Because she's committed to me. That's the biblical idea. It's not just some emotional feeling, because if it was an emotional feeling, what would God feel about most of us most of the time? Get out of my sight, you worthless worm. So, it's not an emotional attachment. It's a commitment on the part of God. It's a relationship built on a deep foundational commitment. And I suggest to you that that deep foundational commitment is in the third word, preordained. the purposed relationship of God to his people. It's not a reaction. The love of God is not a reaction. It is not God looking at you and go, oh, hey, I see something in you that I kind of like, so I'm going to love you. No. I know that's how most people think it is, because that's how human love often works, right? We fall in love with somebody even though we've not known them, but suddenly we know them and then ta-da! But that's not how it works with God. No, God has purposed before the foundation of the world to connect himself to individuals and commit himself to those individuals. That's why it's preordained. It's a decreed intention of God to commit himself to a specific people, not just a reaction. That's the love of God. We need to get out of our minds this idea that it's some sort of emotional reactionary response of God, because that's not biblical. Agape love is the kind of love that God purposed to lavish upon a specific people even before he built a single atom in the universe. When he and his Son and the Spirit covenanted together to create a world and establish a people and call those people out in Christ by sending his Son into the world to die for them and then to send his Spirit to raise them from the dead, to bring them to himself. That is love. Agape love. Now, I suppose I really could add to my definition the preordained connection and commitment of God towards others who would not love him on their own. Okay, I really should put that on the back end. It has a tendency to negate my definition too much or make it too negative, so I left it off. But the bottom line is that if God were reactionary, if in fact the love of God were a reaction to us, what in fact would God see in us that's lovable? And the answer is nothing. Because the entirety of the human race, by virtue of what Adam did in the garden, is now in open rebellion and hatred of him. The synergistic idea that God simply looks down through the corridors of time and sees human beings that will respond to him and then he lavishes his love upon them is preposterous on its face. Because first of all, God doesn't look down the corridors of time. Okay, there's no such thing. God is eternally present. All things are before him. And what does he see eternally before him? A race of beings who despise him and hate him and are in open rebellion against him. But he chooses to put his love upon them. He puts his commitment to them. He makes a connection to them. And he has chosen to do that before any of them were born. So the theme of the book flows out of the phrase, God is love. But there's another phrase that's repeated again which is similar to it. And it's the love of God. It appears in 2:5, 4:9, and 5:3. So I look at that and say, you know what, that sounds very similar to God is love, the love of God, right? So I think that's part of it. That God both embodies the divine love, meaning his nature is such, and gives that love to others. Now, how do we understand this phrase, the love of God? It's a very difficult phrase, frankly, because that little word of is really very troubling. You might not think so, but it is. Let me suggest to you that this idea of the love of God is the two sides of the same coin. Love is the coin, of is the two sides. There are two sides of it. And let me use an illustration from history to help you understand this idea of the love of God. In the 16th century, there was a young monk by the name of Martin Luther. Luther had spent his entire life struggling with his own sin. He was not a profligate. He was not a man who was given over to sin. He was a good Christian man, struggling to trust in God. He was doing what the church of his day was telling him to do, but he still struggled with his sin. He knew that he was a sinner, and he knew that God was holy. He understood the holiness of God. In fact, the struggle that Luther had with his sin was the fact that he fully grasped the idea that God was utterly and distinctly and uniquely holy, that there was no sin in him. He was absolutely righteous, and poor Luther was not. Every sin in his life made him think more and more about the gap between himself and the Lord. He would spend hours in the confessional, confessing non-existent sins to his priest, to the point where his priest once said to him, Luther, why don't you go out and actually commit a sin so you have something to come in here and confess? He was overwhelmed by sin and the holiness of God. And he was tasked at Wittenberg of teaching the book of Romans to his students. And he knew that in order to teach this book well, he would need to understand it, of course. So he came to that great statement in Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, where it says that in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And Luther was utterly devastated by that phrase. Devastated because in Luther's mind, the righteousness of God is not good news. How can the gospel, the good news of Jesus, reveal the righteousness of God? Because the righteousness of God means I am utterly unrighteous. He is righteous and I am unrighteous. How can that be good news? Until Luther came to realize that little word "of" wasn't speaking of the inherent righteousness within the very character of God, but rather the righteousness that flows from the character of God into him. He finally understood there's two sides to the coin, the righteousness of God. On the one side, yes, God is righteous. The gospel reveals that God is holy and utterly distinct from everything else. But at the same time, the gospel also reveals that righteousness is imputed to those who will come to Christ by faith. That God takes his righteousness and puts it into the heart and into the lives of those who simply come to Christ with an empty hand of faith. And it was an utterly radical experience for him, which, as you know, launched the Protestant Reformation. An understanding of that little word righteousness, that little word "of" in the righteousness of God. And it's exactly the same here. In this book, in this letter, we'll call it that, right? There are two sides to this idea. And let me take you to chapter 4, verses 10 and 11 to help make the point. Go to chapter 4, 10 and 11. On the one side is the love of God that is inherent within the very nature of God himself, the very character of God by which God is love. That side is 1 John 4:10. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sin. When did God decide to do that? Before the foundations of the world. When he sent his Son, was he making a commitment to people? Of course. The preordained connection and commitment was Christ going to the cross because he and his Father had agreed to do so before the foundation of the world, and establishing a connection of Yahweh to a people. That's the love that's inherent in God himself. It's within the very nature of God. It's within the very nature of the Christ that he would come and die for a people. The love of God. The love in God. The love that's part of his nature as God. But now look at verse 11. The other side of the coin. Beloved. Notice the word. Beloved, those who are loved. If God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Not only is there a love that's inherent within God, but there's also a love that's been imputed to us. Just as Luther knew that God's righteousness was inherent in him, he came then to understand that God's righteousness is also in us. And what we will learn from this letter, as I give you these two verses as examples, that there is a love that's inherent within the very nature of God himself, and there is a love that comes out of the nature of God into us, that flows out of us, that becomes a part of our nature. Just as God's righteousness changes the nature of a man to be righteous by faith, so the love of God becomes part of the nature of the man who comes to God by faith. The contention then of 1 John is simple. The love of God, which flows from the very nature of God, has been lavished upon us in Christ, and means that we are to love others with the same kind of love. It is inherent within God. God is love, and it has also been imputed to us, the love of God. See it? Two sides, the same coin. The writer wants us to know that God is love, yes. But the writer also wants us to know that we too, by trusting in Christ, by coming through Christ, also possess that divine love. If we truly understand this divine agape in us, we will then act accordingly. We will then act accordingly. Let me end by reminding you of a story at the end of the fourth gospel. Chapter 21 of the Gospel of John seems like an add-on. But in the midst of that story, you remember that Jesus comes to Peter. After his resurrection, after Peter has seen them alive, and he comes to Peter, chapter 21, verses 15 to 17, and 3 times Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times. 3 times Jesus comes to him and says, "Do you love me?" And Peter, of course, responds, "Yes, Lord, I love you." And second time, "Yes, of course." And the third time, "Man, don't you get it? I love you." Paraphrasing. And Jesus each time says, "Feed my lambs," or "feed my sheep." What's the point? The gospel writer is doing in the fourth gospel exactly the same thing he's going to be doing here. To drive into Peter, Jesus' words are to drive into Peter, and John's words to drive into us, the realization that the love Jesus has shown unto him and us must be requited. Meaning, it must be demonstrated. It must flow out of us. It must flow out of us back to God, and it must flow out of us to everybody else. We must love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. See it? John is going to teach us in this letter, listen, God has loved you with an everlasting love. He has loved you because it is his very nature. It is who he is in his commitment to you, in his connection to you, which is preordained before the foundation of the world because it's in the very nature of God. This is what God has done for you. Go, therefore, and do likewise. This is what the Gospel of John, I believe, is about. The theme of this book. The love of God, inherent in him and inherent in us as those who follow Christ. So, hopefully I have piqued your interest in examining this little letter, examining the true nature of the love of God in us.